everybody. I'm Cheryl Hart. I'm the Vice President of Coalition of Refuge Friends and Advocates. Welcome to our webinar today. This is our quarterly government affairs webinar. And without taking up any more time, I will introduce Libby Markey, who is the Director of Government Affairs for the National Wildlife Refuge Association, and a little later on, Caroline Brower, who most of you know was the previous Vice President of Government Affairs for National Wildlife Refuge Association, will be with us also. She's doing some consulting work, and so they're going to tell us about what's going on with the government. So I'll turn it over to Libby.
Yeah, thanks, Cheryl. All right, let me share my screen. Does that look right to everybody?
Yes.
Yes,
okay. It is. Perfect. Okay, great. Well, thank you all for joining today. Yeah, we're just going to talk about some recent things that have been going on for the last few months in Congress and the types of things that the Refuge Association has been active on. So we'll talk about appropriations, which I know everybody cares about, some refuge-specific issues that we're covering, some issues that impact the system as a whole. And then we want to get into a little bit of what we're working on in terms of the staffing challenges that we all know exist within the refuge system. And then, of course, talking about how you as a Friends organization and individually can get involved. So appropriations, and if you've joined any of my webinars in the past, these will all look familiar to you. I'm recycling these, but I think it's important just to keep going over what these numbers are and what our funding ask is, just so we can keep in mind just how dire the funding situation really is. So, so our current appropriations level sits at 519 million, which is only a 16 million increase since FY 2010. And we saw a large increase in the president's budget proposal, which was awesome. However, the House and Senate appropriations bills, when they came out, we saw a little bit less than that. So that's what we're working with in FY 23. And this is the breakdown of where we want to see funding going. So the Refuge Association is requesting 712 million in FY 23 for the operations and maintenance account. And this is the breakdown of where we'd like to see that money going. And here's just a handy little chart that really shows, just how much the funding levels have not kept up with inflation. So we base this off of FY 2010 levels. So the 503 million that the refuge system received in FY 2010 is now worth about 641 million today. So we asked for 712 just to account for that, just inflation levels, and then also account for like the new programmatic things that the refuge system has introduced since FY 2010. So the blue lines on this graph, the light blue is the president's budget request, and then the dark blue is the Refuge Association's funding request of 712 million. So what's up with appropriation now? So just last night, the funding for the government ends on September 30th. So that's this coming Saturday. So Congress has been in a rush to come to an agreement on at least a continuing resolution, in this case, a short-term one. So just last night, they came to an agreement on a continuing resolution that will last until December 16th. And this one doesn't include any kind of controversial provisions, such as the energy permitting reform provisions that Senator Manchin was hoping to include on there. So he withdrew that effort to get it included so that we can pass a short-term stopgap funding measure. So there is still some time to weigh in on FY 23. Just today, the Refuge Association put out an action alert for reaching out to your member of Congress, asking about increasing funding up to that 712 million in the bill. So there's still time to do that. Eden can post a link to that action alert in the chat, and we'll also send that in a follow-up email afterwards. So now for FY 24. So the administration has already begun their process for figuring out FY24 levels. All the agencies are currently in talks with the Office of Management and Budget, figuring out, what levels they want to include in the president's budget request. But for Congress, the process for FY24 will really begin once the president's budget request is released, which typically is in mid-February. And that's when we will be really ramping up efforts on our end as well. But in preparation for that, the CARE group, the Cooperative Alliance for Refuge Enhancement, is leading a large group letter to President Biden requesting a large increase in funding, accounting for these inflation issues, these like shortage of staffing issues, really laying out why we need an increase in funding. So that letter is still open. We're still hoping to grab some additional signatures. Right now we sit at 51 signatures. And hoping to snag a few more friends groups on board. So if you have some time today to take a look at that, get your friends organization signed on, we can really show some additional support for increased funding in FY24. And we'll send a link for that as well. So you'll notice in the letter that we're not asking for a specific funding amount, and that's because we're currently in conversations with the Fish and Wildlife Service and other groups in our coalition to talk about, we base this 712 number off of inflation numbers, but what is the true need, the true funding need for the refuge system? And we expect it to be, at least 1 billion, probably more. So we're in those conversations to really determine what is the real funding number. Once we have that specific data set in hand, then we can really start pushing for that number and pushing it out both to Congress and within the administration as well. So that's what we're looking forward to in FY24. So some of the refuge-specific issues that we've been working on, a lot of you probably saw some of the work we were doing around lead ammunition and tackle regulations. And this was, the Refuge Association with other groups sent in public comments supporting this phase out of lead used for hunting and angling on a variety of refuges, as well as supporting a Fish and Wildlife Service decision to not allow hunting with lead ammunition or fishing on any newly opened refuge lands. So several friends groups also participated in the public comment process, which we appreciate. But this was a great push to support that phase out. And within that public comment, we were also urging an expedited timeline. So they were looking towards 4 years for the phase out, and we were urging for 18 months. So a little bit expedited. We've also been a little bit active on refuge expansion. So just as an example, we signed a letter supporting an expansion of the Pacific Remote Islands Marine National Monument. Have also been active on issues in Alaska. So with Eisenbeck National Wildlife Refuge, we're involved in litigation. There was a Ninth Circuit Court decision that upheld a Trump-era land exchange in the refuge that would basically approve a road to go through the refuge, which really threatens, one of the largest conservation laws impacting Alaska, as well as impacts all of Alaska's public lands. So that's a big issue that we've been working on. We're also continuing to be involved in coalition efforts with the Arctic Refuge Defense Campaign. There was a strong push to include a provision within the Inflation Reduction Act to repeal the 2017 Tax Act provision that opened up the Arctic Refuge to development. So there was a really large push for that. Unfortunately, with the Inflation Reduction Act, no amendments were really allowed. So, that wasn't ultimately included, but we'll continue the fight there. Oops, and oh boy, okay. And lastly, we also submitted some public comments regarding a transmission line project that there was a couple proposed routes that would cut right through the Sevieta National Wildlife Refuge. So we were expressing our concerns with how that would likely impact the wildlife there and the habitat there. So that's some of the refuge specific issues we've been working on. We also have been working on some system-wide issues. So as I was mentioning, the Inflation Reduction Act, and if you haven't heard of it, that's basically the budget reconciliation bill. It was a huge package. I think it was the largest climate related package that Congress has ever passed. So it was lots of really cool stuff in there. But we were working, well, first, it did include $121 million to the National Wildlife Refuge System to address the threat of invasive species, increase resiliency and capacity of habitats. And that was included towards Fish and Wildlife Service, but it was also kind of in the form of state grants. So I know that Fish and Wildlife is currently talking to Congress, trying to figure out exactly their intent for how they wanted that money to be distributed. So that was included. The Refuge Association was also trying to include an amendment that would provide funding for, oh my gosh, I keep hitting my keyboard, sorry. That would provide funding to increase staffing levels in the refuge system. And this was after we saw that the National Park Service had received $500 million to address staffing shortages for the park system. So we were just trying to get something equitable for the refuge system. But as I said, amendments were very, very discouraged and not really allowed for the Inflation Reduction Act. So we weren't able to get that included there. Some recent fun news, the Keeping America's Refuges Operational Act just passed the House and now sits in the Senate. And that bill reauthorizes the appropriations for refuge system volunteer, educational, and community partnership programs. And something else to look forward to upcoming October 9th through 15th will be National Wildlife Refuge Week. Our champions on the Hill are introducing the resolutions to designate National Wildlife Refuge Week today. So we're really excited for that, and we'll talk a little bit more about how to engage with that later. There's also this large campaign we're trying to do around specifically the staffing issue, and that's something that Caroline has been leading. So I'll pass it over to her to talk about what that looks like.
Thanks, Libby. I think that anybody who has worked with a Friends group on a refuge knows that lack of staff is probably one of the biggest problems on refuges right now. There just aren't enough staff to do all the biological work, to do surveys, to move water, to, have enough law enforcement, staff visitor centers. There's just not enough staff to do any of those things. Over the last, decade plus, the refuge system has done a lot of work to try and bring down the need for staffing. They've complexed refuges, and basically what that means is they have taken, all these refuges that were staffed, and they have put them into a group. And generally, one of those refuges has staff present on site, and the others just have the staff at that one largest refuge come out and visit and do work out there. There's no permanent staff on those other refuges within that complex. So it alleviates the need to staff all of those refuges. They've set up strike teams. There's an endangered species strike team in particular. I know that there are several of them, and Congress has been interested in funding those. There was funding for an endangered species strike team. Invasive species strike team, not endangered, I apologize. Invasive species strike teams out west in particular, but there are others that are happening as well. And they're also cutting staffing levels down to the bone. There are refuges that used to have 30 staff on them, and now we're looking at 7, 8. Refuges that had 8 staff now have 1 or 2, and others that were smaller have 0 staff. And so the Refuge Association is doing quite a bit of work to raise this issue with the administration. I think that there is, in my opinion, a lack of urgency from the administration and from Congress to fund the refuge system in terms of staffing levels. So we are making this a big campaign to really emphasize the point that staffing levels are incredibly low. I think the refuge system was up to about 3,500 staff about 10, 12 years ago, and they've lost 1,000 staff since then. It's like a 25% cut. They just can't do what they need to do. So we need Friends to help with this. So Libby and I are going to be sending out in follow-ups to this meeting, information on how, some letters to the editor, some drafts, there's some templates that you can use. We're also going to be really asking folks to go and do district office meetings and report back. We're going to send out a form and put it on our website as well, and get a form out to folks so you can report back and make it super simple and easy to let us know who you met with and how the meeting went. And then, if you can invite members to your refuge and really emphasize the staffing issue, that's how Friends can really help. I don't know of any refuges in the entire country that have not lost staff. It's a problem on every single refuge. One of our talking points that we've been using for a number of years now is that over half of refuges are unstaffed, completely unstaffed. There's nobody there. Some of them are closed to the public and others are not. And that's just something that we believe needs to change. So I will pass it back to you, Libby.
Thanks, Caroline. So following up to what Caroline said, there's several ways to get involved with the types of things we're doing in the Refuge Association. So of course, we have that action alert that went out today on FY23. We're also inviting you to sign CARE's FY24 letter to President Biden. And we'll send links for all of this. As I mentioned, Refuge Week is coming up. So we'll be sending out a toolkit to help our supporters, including Friends groups, to really get involved and uplift refuges that during that week, to talk about just how beneficial they are for wildlife in our communities and all the great stuff that they do. So I just included a few draft graphics we're developing that will be very easy to share, throughout the week. It just highlights some cool stuff that the refuge system provides for wildlife and for all of us. So, if you have the time and the means to just post about Refuge Week during that week, that would be great. There's also going to be some, sample tweets. Maybe there will also be like a newsletter blurb that you can work from. So yeah, we're just asking all of our supporters to really help uplift refuges that week and get people excited about everything that the system has to offer us. So look out for that toolkit. It should be coming sometime next week, a little bit in advance of actual Refuge Week. And then, as Caroline mentioned, around that same time, we'll also be sending out a toolkit for that outreach to your elected representatives and that form to report back to the Refuge Association. And a little more helpful resources just to help out as you reach out to your members of Congress. So those are some things to look out for and to get involved with today. And then, other ways to stay involved. We do have a couple of fact sheets that you can use for your own resource and as you're talking to a member of Congress or their staff or whoever wants to learn more about the refuge system. So there's a couple links here, and I will also share this in the follow-up, but one of them outlines they're almost exactly the same, but one of them outlines our funding request for just FY23, and the other one just is a little more generic, takes out that funding ask and just asks, we have all these challenges and we need more funding. So that one is a little more generic in that way. Of course, we always encourage everybody to participate in our action alerts. There's opportunities to submit public comments, as we highlighted earlier. Once the FY24 appropriations process gets started, there will be opportunities to submit hearing testimony as well, and really highlight your refuge and what more funding could mean for you. And then, sometimes there will be opportunities to support legislation like that Keeping America's Refuges Operational Act, and just expressing support for those with your members of Congress as well. And as Caroline mentioned, we are really hoping that our friends can really try to get their electeds out to their refuges just to see how great it is and talk to them about what you're seeing happening on the ground there. I always say that advocacy is best done at the local level. So, to the extent that you're able to do that, that would be very helpful in terms of getting Congress a little more interested and excited about helping out with the refuge system. And of course, keeping in touch with your electeds and just keeping them updated on what you're doing on the ground is always so helpful. In one of my earlier webinars, I was talking about, I'm a former Hill staffer, so I was talking about how whenever I heard from programs from back in the state, or what folks were doing, that really influenced my decisions on who I wanted to go talk to and visit when I went back to the state and what I reported back to the senator. So keeping engaged and sharing your good news and what you're working on is really impactful for congressional staff and your members. So I really encourage that. And then of course, op-eds and letters to the editor, and participating in any community events at the refuge. So there are a number of ways just to stay updated with what we're working on. Of course, you have your Corfa group and the link, the Friends newsletter. And then we have all these resources from the Refuge Association just to keep updated with what we're working on. So that's it for me. I'm happy to answer any questions. I know I kind of blew through a lot of this, but I'm happy to answer questions on anything we're working on.
So Libby, there is, I think that Caroline may have already answered this question, but I think it would be good to at least verbalize it. JV Friday from Friends of Hakala was wondering, does the service continue to acquire more land without having the capacity to staff and manage them? Could they rebalance their budget between the land acquisition side and the management staffing side? And Caroline, do you want to take that and share what you put in the chat?
Sure, absolutely. So, there's a land acquisition pot of money, and then there's operations and maintenance. And operations and maintenance does not acquire, they don't use that money to acquire. That's just to run the refuge and to pay for staffing. They move water with that money. They, use that for law enforcement. They buy guns and cars and all that stuff with that money, repair buildings. The land acquisition money generally comes out of the Land and Water Conservation Fund. There are also other pots of money that do land acquisition, like migratory bird funding does some of that. The NAWCA grants can acquire land. So there's that side of it. I want to be careful not going down the road of discouraging land acquisition because the refuge system doesn't have enough funding. It's a slippery slope. In my opinion, that's what folks who don't like public lands, they want lands to be privately held. I think that a lot of folks who don't like the public land system in this country, they don't want more land acquisition. They're trying to discourage more land acquisition by not funding these public lands in the first place. Especially with climate change and all of these pressures on habitat, I think it's really important that when lands become available, that the Fish and Wildlife Service is ready to acquire them. All lands in the refuge system are acquired by willing sellers. And if you look at the CCP for your refuge, generally, most of these refuges don't have all of their lands acquired yet. And you can look at the maps and you can see what lands are within the acquisition boundaries. And you can see what's going to be what they could acquire if they had the funding and the willing seller. And once those lands become available, I think it's really important that the Fish and Wildlife Service be ready to get them. So I don't want to get bogged down in an argument of, we don't have the funding for staffing, so we can't do more land acquisition. I think we need to push up the funding levels so that we can do both. I think both are very important. Does that help, JB? I hope so.
It does. And I mean, it's a long conversation. I think there are cases where if the refuge system acquires land, but they can't manage it, it really does ring it. Well, was the land better off under its previous owners if it's not being managed? Anyway,
I think it depends on,
understood.
yeah,
Thank you for the explanation. Yep.
yeah, I think it depends on what the land was going to be used for. If it's going to be a Target, then yeah, Target or Walmart, yeah, let's go ahead and get it. I mean, if it's going to be owned by, a land trust, then maybe you could wait. It just really depends on the circumstance. You're right, it is a longer conversation, but
Thank you.
So can I
Of
add
course.
one thing? So this is Jeff Haskin, having worked both on the realty side and the management side of the Fish and Wildlife Service for many years. This is something that comes up all the time, and it's a good question. It's a valid question. The problem is, if people would have looked at it that way anytime over the last 100 years, we wouldn't have the refuge system we have today, because there's never been enough funding. So there'd be a lot of lands we never ever would have picked up. So I think the conversation is a good one to have, but I completely agree with everything Caroline just said about, you need to protect lands when you can. It just gets more expensive over time. With climate change, there's going to be places they need to do it because, sea level rise and marshes disappearing. So big conversation to have, no question about it.
Thanks, Jeff. So a question from Bruce King for Libby. You mentioned the kits will be sent out next week. Are they being sent to this distribution list? I want to be sure to be on the distribution.
Yeah, they should be, because we'll be sending this as a follow-up to all the participants here. And it will also be shared with Corfa and on our website. So there will be several places for you to receive it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Not seeing any other questions. One thing that came up when we always do a little pre-webinar rehearsal kind of thing. And one thing that came up was sometimes it's really important or it's necessary for the take action notices to be responded to very quickly. And for many friends groups, that's a problem because most friends boards meet maybe once a month, some maybe even less often than that. And I mentioned that I through a suggestion from another Friends member, our Friends group gave me permission to sign on our Friends group for any issue that Refuge Association advocates for. So I have that permission in advance. And somebody suggested that I mention that today, that maybe a discussion that you all want to have with your friends group, that there be someone who can quickly respond to those action items that are seeking the friends group. And obviously, as an individual, you can sign on whether you want anytime you want to. But if they're asking for the organization to sign on, if you have someone in your friends group who has permission to sign on without having to go to the board and get a motion and all of those kinds of things, that expedites that advocacy process. So just something to consider. You might want to discuss that with your friends group. It's worked well for us, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Cheryl. And something I just remembered as I'm thinking about Refuge Week, I showed the graphics that kind of have just basic, really fun facts about the refuge system, but within the toolkit, I'll also be encouraging everyone to highlight their local refuge and talk about what makes their local refuge special. So, definitely encouraging you all to, make some kind of post or do a newsletter or a blog or something like that, where you could talk about your own local refuge and what makes it so incredible. So just wanted to make sure folks were aware of that too.
And something that Corfa and NWRA have been working on and trying to prepare some presentations on are how to tell your story. How do you tell your story in a way that is compelling to the people that you're trying to influence? And so we're looking for some resources and trying to put together some maybe a series of webinars on how to tell your story. And so look for those in the future. We don't have anything on the calendar yet, but it is something that we've been talking about and thinking about doing.
So I have a question for the group. Are there anything that we all can be doing to make our efforts with regards to advocacy easier for each other, for our organizations? Are there any particular challenges that you're seeing or things that you've done that have been very successful? And since we don't have any questions in the chat, can people just unmute themselves or raise their hands if you have something to share? We have a quiet group today.
Yeah,
Well,
this is the part of the webinar that we like to turn it over to friends and
I have a
hear what you
related
say.
question, actually. I'm wondering if you have any statistics on the percentage of friends groups that have a paid staff, as it seems with the decrease in staffing across the refuge system, it would be helpful to have some guidance sharing how friends groups have achieved this successfully so that we could, we don't, right now we're all volunteer at San Pablo Bay Friends Group. And it just makes me wonder about what might be possible if we had a part-time executive director or something like that to give more community outreach and support for the staff that's running the refuge.
Mm-hmm.
This is Dick Relling from the Friends of Necedah National Wildlife Refuge. We don't have any paid staff, and we've done our best to avoid it for a couple of reasons. Number one is we don't have the money. That's the obvious one. And number two, I think it's a philosophical thing with many of us on our board that we're a volunteer organization, and as such, we ought to make sure all of our monies go to the refuge. On the issue of what we are doing, we have two people that we designate for political action. Maybe that's not a correct term, but I am one of those two people. I've done this for a number of years for us. We try to keep our local officials involved. We try to keep our state officials involved and our federal officials involved. The difficulty we have is in our particular political climate right now in Wisconsin, we really don't have what you would call many advocates for the refuge system. We have a great number of people, and I won't mention any parties, and you can infer what I'm saying. We have a great deal of representatives who, quite frankly, see the refuge as being extremely low priority. It's tough. It is really tough. I myself have beaten my head into the ground for quite a few years trying to talk to these people. Many of these people won't even talk to us. They don't even respond. They don't respond to letters. We've asked every one of them to visit us. As of right now, only one has come. That's Senator Baldwin. So it's a tough political environment that we're working in. Thank you.
So I agree, there's no question that it's challenging, but to me, I just think about what the possibilities are if we even had somebody 10 hours a week that was a dedicated resource versus, we've got a number of parents with young kids who work full-time jobs. It's great, we're volunteers, but we have limited time. And so 10 hours a week is 500 hours a year to help connect the community to our refuge. And just wondering, I imagine some refuges do have paid staff. So has that been looked at? Is it half of them? Is it only 10%? Do you have any idea what the ratio is?
Hey, Bruce, years ago, I took a look at it. And at that point, there was like a dozen groups that had staff members. Some of it gets into this philosophical discussion that Dick mentioned, do you want to stay as all volunteer? Do you need to acquire some staff? There's lots of different thoughts on that.
Sure.
But since that time, last time I looked at it, when I used to work for the Refuge Association, and now I'm part of Corfa, I know that the number of friends groups that have hired part-time or full-time staff has changed. And in doing that, some of the things that the board has to do has changed. You know, you're more into the governance of the group, and you're now switching to be more fundraising. So it's part of that decision-making process. And a lot of it's just is based upon what the needs of your board happens to be.
Thanks, Joan.
Okay. And then, Dick, I have to comment on this. So, you know, there are a number of members of Congress and at both the state and local level that may not see refuges as priorities. And it is discouraging. And it, you know, it's for some of us, it's heartbreaking. These are important places. You know, we want you to recognize this. Some of the groups have had some success at times, like the Friends of Red River in Louisiana. I happen to have the privilege of going to the Hill and testifying on that CARO Act. And they had somebody from Ducks Unlimited talking about expanding the boundaries of that refuge. So sometimes, I know this is sad news, but we as Friends are not always the group that needs to deliver the message to some of these members of Congress. If at times we can find other individuals or other entities that can help deliver that message, some of our members of Congress are a little bit more receptive, just based upon who's asking, unfortunately.
That's a good point. We've been somewhat successful in involving other groups and other people. Our local economic development corporation has done a pretty good job for us under the circumstances.
Mhm.
We do have people that are involved in Ducks Unlimited. We recently got a grant from the Turkey Federation to do some work at the refuge. So we're doing, you know, pretty good in those areas. The frustrating thing though is to us, and I'm sure to a lot of us, is that still, it makes it, we're not getting to the people who control the purse strings. And that's the difficult thing. We're operating right at Necedah right now with one staff member in visitor services. In order for us to remain open on a Saturday, we have to depend upon a part-time custodian coming in. If he doesn't come in, we have to close. It makes it almost really difficult to operate. And there is some frustration on the part of our visitors. You know, we've heard from a number of visitors said, well, we came Saturday and you were closed. Well, the refuge rules requires that there be a staff member present, which makes sense to me. If that staff member is not present, we have nothing we can do. We have to shut down.
Mhm.
And that, you know, that affects the visitors, it affects our nature store. It affects what we can eventually donate to the refuge. So it's horribly frustrating.
Yeah, and it's got to be hard even to, you know, get volunteers if you can't even figure out if you're going to be open.
Yeah, because a lot of times we'll get a volunteer. We need 2 volunteers. We need one at the front desk and we need one at the nature store. We get people who are willing to do those 2 jobs. And on Friday night, we have to call them up and say, guess what? Our part-time custodian has a meeting someplace else. He can't make it to work tomorrow. We're closed. Well, it doesn't take long before people say, well, why should I commit to a Saturday if the Saturday isn't going to be there? So it's frustrating.
Yes, sounds it. And a lot of good stories there to share with, you know, in your newsletters and letters to the editors and stuff. David, I see your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Joan. I'd like to come back to that issue of staff. As you know, we have 16 refuges that we deal with, and it keeps us awfully busy, especially our board and our small group. And we have a part-time person that helps a lot, and we couldn't function without that small amount of help. But we really need to explore getting a part-time ED And I would appreciate it, and I'm sure everybody would, if the people who know the lay of the land in terms of what possible funding sources there are for applying for grants to get seed money to hire a part-time or even a full-time executive director, would be extremely helpful if we had some suggestions about places to look for funding.
Good idea, David.
Sounds like another topic for a webinar.
Is that something that someone can follow up on? You know, the world of grants is outside my purview and expertise, and I'm betting there are people on this call that understand that and know how to tap into them and find them. And it would be great if the Friends group, if we were provided on this distribution list, some information about it. You know, no urgency, but you know, by the end of the year kind of thing, somebody could provide something together, or as you said, Joan, an idea for a webinar.
What if we were to try to get some friends that have done it in a panel discussion to share how they've gone about starting that funding process?
It's a great
That
idea.
would be great. Yeah.
Oh, I love it when you guys share your ideas with us. Thank you.
Yeah, these ideas are great, and it's super helpful for us. I mean, I remember when we did the insurance webinar, I mean, I was kind of skeptical that that was a useful thing, but I mean, I've heard people raving about the insurance webinar. So, you know, those kind of topics, you know, it's super helpful for y'all to let us know, you know, what you're interested in.
And JB, I see you have a hand raised.
Yeah, I was going to mention, not with our Friends group, which we don't have staff, but another conservation group on the island supports their staff largely by taking on projects and then charging overhead. In fact, I think they could charge more overhead from it. But again, they take on land management projects and get grants for those projects. And then the overhead from the grant goes to support staff to administer those projects and other things like keeping up a membership database and sending out notices to the members and such. So it is, you're still on the cycle of always chasing the next grant to keep your staff employed. Yeah, that's seems to be the way it is.
So I'm going to tie this into the CARO Act. So just to give you guys a heads up. At one point, there was some interpretation of that Keep America's Refuges Open Act that talks about the service can use volunteers and the service can go into partnership with community groups. There's a phrase in there that's something like, if you enter into a cooperative agreement with Fish and Wildlife Service, these community partner groups cannot get overhead costs, basically. And the service looked at this and it's like, okay, do we need to change the wording? They've really come back to like Linda Schnee, the National Friends Coordinator, and her boss, Maggie O'Connell, have said, no, we need to be interpreting that differently. That a Friends organization, if they enter into a cooperative agreement with the service, part of the cost of doing that project needs to include the administrative costs. So if you ever get any pushback on it, that's the latest interpretation. I just want to share that with you, okay? Any other things?
You don't mind? I would like to I would like to ask everyone to please take a moment sometime today and think about all of our friends on the southwest coast of Florida who are going through hell right now, especially Ding Darling. The Eye of Ivan went directly over Sanibel on its way to Punta Gorda and Fort Myers. So everyone from Sanibel and the southwest side over here to Fort Lauderdale and up at Merritt Island are all being affected by this nasty storm. So please just think about them. Sorry. A lot of them had to evacuate.
Yeah. Becca, how
Thank
are
you.
you doing
Thank
at
you.
your site in Florida?
Well, we're just getting the feeder bands or the tail from Ivan, which is actually called the dirty side of the storm. It comes with tornado warnings and really, really strong wind gusts and torrential rain. But I think we're on the downside of the rain and now just having to get through the really strong wind gusts and everything. And so we're just kind of hanging on. And that's why Charlie had to leave in Merritt Island, because those feeder bands, because the storm now is so close to Fort Myers, that those feeder bands are stretching all across the state and will go all the way up the state. And this also includes our friends from the Suwannee National Wildlife Refuge and all of the other ones up and down the coast and in between. So it's affecting everyone in the whole state, and it will soon cross into the southeast Georgia and give them a rash load of trouble. But no tornado warning yet, knock wood. You'll see me duck under the table if that happens.
This is Barbara.
Lane.
I'd like to jump in with one other follow-up question from before. I know that there used to be capacity building grants, which were very, very useful from the Fish and Wildlife Foundation. Is there a comparable source of that kind of money that's available at this point? How did that pan out? I think wasn't
Let me
something
turn this off. Okay.
around
It's
additional
just it's a call I was listening in on.
additional grants of that nature?
Anybody want to take that? Barbara, I have not, the last that I heard was that Fish and Wildlife Service did not have money for those grants at this time. And I have not heard of anyone else with capacity building grants. At one point, the National Environmental Education Foundation had them, but they have not had them for, I think, the last 2 years either. So we need to find a new source.
Yeah, that's really too bad because again, we're talking about how staff is useful, but gee, it's nice to get money for a new laptop or a database management software or all of those kinds of things that require some cash. But thanks for that answer. That's something that if there's some way to elevate that, that would be really, I think, useful to friends groups across the board.
For sure.
Thanks, Barbara. Lane, I see your hand up.
Hello, this is Lane. I'm a member of Friends of Hakalau with JB being the president. But several things. First of all, good luck to everybody in Florida. We hope that you guys are safe. The former manager of the Hakalau Refuge lives in Florida now, and he had to evacuate. So I wish everybody well on that. Number two is if your board does elect to have someone as their spokesman who's allowed to answer to legislation or take a position for the board without coming back to the meeting and asking the full board for permission, they should also look at doing things about covering state and local type ordinances, because in Hawaii, some of the state hunting rules impact what happens on the refuge. And so if a person can respond to state legislation, it helps. And number three is, as we talk about paid staff, I think each board has to look at itself and determine internally, are we talking about staff to help man a visitor center? Are we talking about staff that is helping to ensure income, like if you have a nature store? Or are you looking at staff to help coordinate volunteer services? Because each of those is a different sort of bucket, and some of them may take different funding sources. But philosophically, it may make a difference. Like in the Friends of Hakalau, the refuge is closed. So mostly if you had a staff member or a paid staff on the Friends, it would probably be to help coordinate volunteers through the Friends group. Right now, we're lucky that they do have a part-time coordinator for volunteers within the refuge system itself. But that's just a few extra thoughts.
Thanks, Lane. All good points. Just to expand a little bit on what I said about having permission to respond to the take action items. That was mainly so that we could respond quickly when there's a quick turnaround time. For example, when Libby published the letter to President Biden, she requested responses within, I think, about a day. So you don't have time to go to your board for a vote for that kind of thing. So that's the kind of thing that is important to have a procedure in place so that someone can go ahead and respond to that. But that's not to say that's the only thing that an advocacy person on the board should do. Yes, you're absolutely right. We take on local issues, state issues, national issues. Pretty much it's our responsibility to try and stay on top of whatever might be impacting the refuge or the refuge system and bring that to the board for their approval of whatever action you might take. Does that help clarify?
Yeah, it's what we've done at NACEDA is we really haven't defined what we can respond, the two of us can respond to, but it's almost evolved into a situation where it's exactly as you say. If it's something comes up and it needs to be addressed, both myself and the other person who are involved. For example, I was a lobbyist. I know that's a dirty word, but I was a lobbyist for a large number of years of my career. So I kind of know what we can do and what we can't do in terms of the Friends group. I know that's kind of a wishy-washy way of putting it, but it seems to work out pretty well for us. And just one last thought on what Lane said. I think he hit on one of the difficulties we've looked at as far as hiring a person, and we have looked at it, is just what that person is hired to do, and how much time and money can we afford to pay that individual. We see our volunteers manning the front desk in the nature store, but it would be nice to have a full-time nature store manager. But it would also be nice to have somebody who coordinated membership activities. We again do that on a volunteer basis. So that's a tough area. I think we ought to look at that a little closer. Thank you.
Thank you, Dick. We're almost out of time. Just quickly, the upcoming webinars. In October, we're going to be doing a end-of-year fundraising webinar with Courtney Lewis, who is the development director for NWRA and helping us with that important end-of-year appeal. November, Joan, do you want to talk about November?
Eric Alvarez from Fish and Wildlife Service, who is chief of realty, budget, and a bunch of other things, is going to be doing a webinar for us on how the federal budget is put together, and then how, once the budget is approved, things are disseminated. So it ties into what Libby's been talking about and Caroline with regards to appropriations. So that would be, I believe it's November 16th. And then Cheryl, you want to talk about the December webinars?
Well, December, we're going to do a celebration of all of the wonderful things that Friends have accomplished over the last year. And we hope all of you will participate in that, because every Friends group has something that they I hope that they feel good about that they've been able to do. And we also want to recognize the groups that have received special honors, Refuge of the Friends Group of the Year and the O'Brien Prize, and some of the things that are special recognition for Friends groups. So that's going to be a celebration of Friends, and we really hope that everybody can participate in that. We want it to be a feel-good time.
And then there will probably be one other webinar in December at the beginning of the month, and this webinar may be repeated at times, but Fish and Wildlife Service, if you remember from the Friends Partnership Agreement, in Chapter 1, Exhibit 1, it talks about the reporting requirements that Friends will have with regards to letting the service know some, any relevant stories. And I think it talks about, your finances in terms of donations and things like that. But the service won't be collecting any of that information until sometime next year. They would like to do a webinar with us beginning of December so people can understand what sort of information they are actually looking for, so that as going into year 2023, people can start pulling together that information. From what I understand, they are trying to keep any reporting requirements as simple as possible. Okay. Keep your fingers crossed. Okay.
This is Bill McCoy at Patoka River in southwest Indiana. I had a question regarding the discussion we just had about the designated spokesperson for the Friends group. I'm wondering if, if we're talking to congressmen and local officials and letter to the editor and public communication, I know the regional office had set up some pretty strict guidelines even for refuge managers in their public contacts. And I'm wondering, if how you all feel about if a Friends spokesperson starts communicating with the public, if there's going to be concern from refuge managers with us speaking out on subjects that perhaps they don't feel free to speak out about. And how would we get around with that? How would we deal with that? Any comments?
This is Cheryl, and my comment is you have to have open communication with your refuge staff. They are very limited as to what they can say and do in terms of advocacy and, in terms of lobbying. And we have fewer restraints, but you don't ever want to blindside your refuge staff. You want to have a conversation with them about your intention. You don't have to get their permission, but you certainly don't want to, as I say, you don't want to blindside them. So that open communication between whoever's doing the advocacy for your Friends group and your refuge management is really critical.
Yeah, I know.
My experience has been they're very appreciative, but part of the reason they're very appreciative is we've had a behind the scenes conversation.
This is David Raskin from Friends. The way we deal with that is I'm the advocacy chair, but anything that affects the Friends group directly and involves us in any potential litigation or financial commitment has to be approved by our board. But what we do with regard to the refuges, at our board meetings, we regularly have people from the regional office on our board meetings, and we discuss in great detail what's going on, what advocacy we're doing, and so on. So we maintain a very close relationship with them and know exactly where we are, where they are, and coordinate, and often are asked to do things that they can't do. But I think the important thing is to have regular communication with refuge staff, and we do it with the regional office because we have 16 refuges.
Yeah, we at Nacito, we run almost everything by our refuge manager and our visitor services manager. That might be of a sensitive nature. most of what we advocate for is for, the refuge itself. And we have never had one instance that I can recall where they've said, oh, you can't do that, or you shouldn't do that. So we have a philosophy that's based on one thing, and that's what we do is to benefit the refuge. And we would never, ever do anything that would undermine or blindside the staff. We have to work with them.
Yeah. And Dick,
I think it all comes back to, go ahead, Joan.
You make a really good point. You don't want to blindside the staff with anything. I would just say that some of my experience, I've got calls from friends groups that have said at times that our refuge manager says that we can't do any lobbying. Yes, you can.
Yeah.
But you need to, as you guys have said, you need to look at what you're looking at and how the service feels and make sure that there's an agreement that they're okay with it. But friends,
that's one of the things that we did is we had an understanding. We have been going through a number of refuge managers. And so one of the things that we do when a new one comes in is sit down and say, basically, we can lobby.
Yeah.
But when we do lobby, we want to make sure that we lobby on your behalf. And that seems to have worked.
Joan, I would just like to add to that, that there are times when we're going to advocate a position which is contrary to what Fish and Wildlife is planning to do. And we've done that in the past, and they know we're doing that. And in many ways, we are helping them to avoid projects that would be damaging to the refuge. So I think we shouldn't be shy about taking a position that's contrary to where they're headed. And in some major instances that I won't go into, we have helped to head off very damaging projects and activities that the state would be due on the refuges. But that was contrary to what was going on within Fish and Wildlife.
I agree with you completely. We've done that too, but what we make sure that they know what we're doing.
Oh yeah, we talk directly with them about these things,
right?
And then we do what we have to do. Usually,
That's
it's
right.
a lot of persuasion, actually, directly with them, and comments on draft statements and things like that.
So David and Dick, for both of you, with direct communication, is that phone, talking in person?
For me, it's in person.
For us, it's usually phone because we're a little geographically distributed, to say the least.
Yeah.
No, the important thing to remember is you don't discuss those things on email or even in a real letter, even in a paper copy of a letter. You do it by telephone or you do it in person.
And in the former administration, we had to do it by personal cell phones, often to people's spouses' phones.
Yes. Yeah.
So you have to be very careful.
Yeah. So we're over time. It's been a great discussion. Thank you for the topics and for participating. Again, if you have ideas for webinars, things that you think would be helpful, several have been mentioned today. We're always looking for ideas from friends groups. We want to be guided by you. So please don't hesitate to let us know if there's a topic that you'd like to have addressed in one of these webinars. And thank you everyone for attending.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.